All right, have you ever had it where you were sure that God was speaking to you, that He was giving you direction, or there was a decision that you had to make, and God was like giving you a sign, and this is the way. And then later, you find out it was all just a mistake. Well, that happened to me a week and a half ago. I was with Pastor Jim. We were talking about Maundy, Thursday, and he had his sermon to do, so I was going to do a little research into what we could do together. And so I looked up the passage for Maundy, Thursday in our reading track, and I found that it was the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000. And if you look at and see how that goes in Luke 9:16, here's what it says. Taking the 5 loaves, Jesus taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke them. Then he gave them to the disciples to distribute them to the people. Okay, then Luke 22 is the Maundy, Thursday passage. It's the Jesus, the night he was betrayed and he instituted the Lord's Supper. Um, and he, Jesus, took bread, gave thanks, and broke it, and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." So we have bread, we have giving thanks, we have breaking, giving it to the disciples. It was like this just writes itself. So I texted Jim. I said, "Hey Jim, look what our reading is," and I explained, how that fits together. And he wrote back, "Ah, oh, that's awesome. God is so good." And I thought, okay, you're way ahead of schedule here. And then Jim texts me about an hour later and says, bad news here. You looked at this Thursday's readings, not the next week, which is Maundy, Thursday. So the story of the feeding of the 5,000 is not on Maundy, Thursday. Back to square one. You ever had that? Where you know God is leading you in a direction, all of a sudden you're back to square one and you have no idea where God is leading you. So that's what happened on a Tuesday. Then there was Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. And then Saturday night, I got a text from my son, Mike, and he said, "Hey, there's a podcast. You should listen to this. It may make a difference on the sermon that you give the next week," which is, this week. So, okay, it was 11:30 at night. I just said, well, I'm going to listen to it. It's a 40-minute thing. And I started listening. And it was the story that I started telling you about this Papa Doc on Maundy, Thursday, about a woman in Chicago. She's a doctor, and her father-in-law is a doctor, 82-year-old doctor in the Seattle area, retired. And anyway, on the phone, finding out that he's coughing and falling asleep a lot. And so she tells him, "You go to the ER right now." It goes to the ER, finds out he has COVID-19. And then she's on the trail of some kind of a cure. And she heard about blood transfusions, which is not a new cure. It's actually an old cure. It's over 100 years old. And how it goes is, the person who has the sickness and then gets over it, somehow they have the antibodies developed in their body, and then you take their blood, and then you purify it and make plasma, or however they do that, and then they infuse it back into the sick person. Okay, they take it from the person who beat it, infuse it into the sick person, and then those amino acids or whatever they are, fight for this person who is sick, and then people recover. And this is something that worked with diphtheria, it's worked with other things. And so she was all excited about that and wanted to do that with her father-in-law. By the way, this is not just some fly-by-night kind of thing. 2 days ago, I read something about the Mayo Clinic actually taking on this whole study to see if this really works or not. So it's a thing. So anyway, she's in this phone interview, and they're talking and so on, and she's telling the story. So what she did one night is, it was like 11:30 at night. She just made a little Twitter post and just asked her Twitter world, "Hey, is anyone out there in the Seattle area that could give blood type? I want to try to use it with my father-in-law." And she thought, well, I'll check it, tomorrow morning, and we'll see if there's anyone that responded to it. Well, within 5 minutes, there were like 200 people responded to it. People that wanted to donate, people that, this is my type blood, and this is when I got over it. Here's my doctor's report. And then there were other people who said, well, I have a sick relative in New York. Do you know anyone in New York that could give blood? And for the next 3 days, this is all that she's doing. I mean, she just got inundated with all these things. So as the interview goes on, back and forth, and what's going to happen, you're the father-in-law, where we're going to infuse him tomorrow, and we hope it's going to do well. And then she says some very interesting things that I want you to just have a listen.
I think that having an infection, maybe even being critically ill from it, recovering, and then saying, I know how awful that was, how scary that was, how absolutely uncertain everything felt when I was sick. And I have the capacity, myself, I can go give plasma, and if I give a plasma donation, like a plasmapheresis donation where they take off 3 units of plasma, I can treat 3 people with this. That's it. Because, it's interesting. Every virus has a number that we call R naught. It's like R sub-0. R naught is how it's pronounced. And that number is how many people an average infected person will themselves infect. So if you look at, some of our less contagious things like seasonal flu, those are closer to 1. If you look at Spanish flu, it was about 2 or a little more than 2. So each person who got infected on average gave 2 other people the infection. And this virus, SARS-CoV-2, is closer to 3. So that means everybody on average who's got it is going to give it to 3 other people. So it feels kind of cool, like there's some sort of order in the universe that each person who gets it, who donates plasma, can actually treat 3 people.
Wow. I didn't realize it was 3. I thought it was at most 2.
Yeah, it's 3. And I just, what do I call it? I don't know what. The symmetry of that in the universe, that the R naught for this virus is 3, and the number of people that a plasma donor can treat after they've been infected is 3. It just feels like, I don't know, there's something beautiful about that.
All right. I find it really interesting that she says, this would be really cool. There's symmetry in the universe, or order in the universe, or she was trying to find some words to describe this, because I think a lot of times people in the scientific community, they want something miraculous, but they just have a hard time identifying that with God. But it's still there. They're recognizing that there's something there. I mean, so anyway, when I heard this, I thought, wow. This relates to the Jesus feeding the 5,000. When I heard this podcast, I realized that God was speaking to me. And this is what I realized, that God knows me better than I know myself. God knows that I'm prone to mistakes. And so God put what he wanted me to see on the wrong date because he knew I'd be looking at the wrong Thursday. Isn't that awesome? That God knows us so well that he anticipates our mistakes. So don't get discouraged if you make a few mistakes. God knows all about what you're capable of. And God can work out his plan through your mistakes. So I know some of you are going, okay, yeah, okay, you're all excited about this, but I don't get the connection between what this lady just said and the feeding of the 5,000. And that's because I haven't explained it yet. So if we go to the story of the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus was teaching near Bethsaida, and he was healing people and teaching, and there was a huge crowd. And then at some point, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let's go to a solitary place." So they got in the boat and they start rowing away. But the Sea of Galilee is a big lake, but you can still see it across it, and you can see the boat, and the people just followed. As the boat is going down the shore, the people just walked down the shore. No matter how far they went, the people just kept going. So finally, the disciples and Jesus give up. They go into shore, and Jesus starts teaching. And the passage says there's 5,000 men, which means if there's women and children, there might be 10, 15,000 people. I mean, what does that even look like? One of my favorite artists is James Tissot, and he made this painting of Jesus teaching the crowds. And what I love about this picture, you see the Sea of Galilee in the distance, but you see that long line of people on a trail coming to hear Jesus. I mean, it must have been a huge crowd, something like this. So Jesus teaches them, he's healing, he's doing all these things, and the people have walked a long ways from the city. It's now getting towards evening. No one has eaten yet. And so Jesus says to his disciples, we'll feed them. And the disciples say, we have 5 loaves and 2 fish. How are we going to feed them? And Jesus said, just divide them into groups of 50 and just feed them. And then he, taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke them. Then he gave them to the disciples to distribute to the people. Simple. Okay, but here's my question. Where did the miracle take place? Where did the miracle take place? I mean, Jesus took the bread, he broke it. Okay, there are 5 loaves. If you broke them in half, there would be 10 loaves. He gives them to his disciples. There's 12 of them. So there's no need for a miracle yet. Okay, breaks the fish. Okay, now the disciples go out and they go to maybe different groups of 50. But the disciples can't go to every individual person, 10,000 people. It would take till the next morning. So they hand it to somebody who then takes a piece and hands it to somebody else, who takes a piece and then hands it to somebody else. So where does the miracle take place? The miracle takes place in the hands of the people. The miracle happens when this person who has the bread gives it to the person who doesn't have the bread. Okay, did you see why when I heard this podcast, I made this connection? Because the person who has gotten over the virus, the person who has been saved from the virus, is now the very person who infuses their blood into the person who needs it. One gives it to the other. And notice in the podcast, the lady said that it's 1 to 3. If you give blood, you can help 3 people. Pastor Jim read from the resurrection story from the book of Mark. I talked about the book of Mark. I talked about this passage a few weeks back when we talked about the Garden of Gethsemane. Remember the young man who had a linen garment, and then the soldiers grabbed him and he ran away leaving his linen garment? Remember the Greek word young man is a very specific word. It's rarely used. And then when we go to the end of the chapter where it's talking about the resurrection, 3 women go to the tomb. There might have been others, but 3 are mentioned. 3 women go to the tomb, and it's a young man, the same exact Greek word, who's sitting on this stone, this person we don't even know who it is. He's the first person to tell the good news of Jesus' resurrection. This guy that we don't even know who he is. And who does he tell? The 3 women. And what do the 3 women do? They go back and tell the disciples. And what do the disciples do? They tell other people. And they tell other people. And then in the book of Acts, Jim mentioned that, in the book of Acts, Peter gives a sermon and 2,000 people get told and become saved. And then at the end of the book of Acts, it says, and the people broke bread in their homes, and the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. The miracle happens in the breaking of the bread. The body of Jesus died on the cross, and then it's symbolized by the breaking of the bread, and that's passed on. And the miracle happens when we pass it on. When we who are saved pass it on to those who need to be saved. Isn't that interesting? I know what some of you are saying. So how do I do that? I'm not gifted. I don't have, I'm not a preacher. I am inadequate. I don't know what I could do. I don't know how to pass this good news on. I realize I've received it, yes. And I'm trying to do the best I can with my family and so on, but I don't know how to go beyond that. Remember the disciples? Jesus came to the disciples and said, okay, there's 5, 10,000, 15,000 people here, and we have 5 loaves and 2 fish. All right, you feed them. And the disciples are, how are we going to do that? We are totally inadequate. We can't do this. And Jesus says, just divide them into 50, and breaks it, hands it to them. And they go and do it. And my guess is the disciples aren't even aware of what's going on because the miracle isn't happening in their hands. It's not their doing. They're just doing the best they can with what they have. And somehow the miracle of the breaking of the bread just takes place among the people. This person gets saved and just passes it on to the next person. So you may feel inadequate. You may not have any idea of what you could possibly do. How are you, the saved one, going to help people who aren't? Do something. Take what you have, whatever gift that you have. Pass it on to somebody else. Hey, maybe it's an email. Maybe it's a text. Maybe it's a Zoom thing. Maybe it's dropping something off at a neighbor's house. Maybe it's a word of encouragement. Maybe it's, offering to pick up some groceries for somebody. Next time you buy a thing of milk, drop a couple at your neighbor's house. I don't know. Or that person at work who is needs the Lord. I don't know what it is that God is calling you to do. Do whatever it is that you have. Because somehow in the doing, in the breaking of the bread, eyes are open. That's the story of the 2 men on the road to Emmaus. Their eyes are blind. They had all this teaching, they had connections, but they didn't get it until Jesus broke the bread, and we are the representatives of Jesus. Break the bread for people. What is that? Something. Give what you have. Let's pray together. Lord, you do speak to us. And it's so good that you speak to us even in our mistakes. I made a mistake, and you used the mistake to produce the message that you wanted. Not the message I wanted, the message that you wanted. I could have never guessed this. And you did that with the disciples too. They had no idea that 5 loaves and 2 fish could feed 10,000 people. They had no idea. They just were obedient. They just did what they were told to do. They did what they could. They brought what they had. The early church grew from one man. Some person we don't even know. We don't even know his name. This virus started with one person, probably somewhere in China. We don't know who that is either. And look, the whole world is dealing with this thing. So one man announced the resurrection. And that went to 3, and that went to 12 or 11, and then that went to 120, and then it went to 2,000. Then it kept going to every single corner of the earth. And people all over the world today, by Skype, by online situations, within households, all over the world. This thing is not stopping the celebration of Easter. For all we know, it's intensifying the celebration of Easter. We cannot stop this pandemic, the pandemic of life. So help us, Lord, to bring that life to those around us in small ways. We just have to offer a few loaves and a couple of fish and leave the rest to you. Lord, I pray a blessing on all of us here at Pathway and those connected to Pathway and anyone listening to this. You want to use us. You want to bless us in this time. Perhaps we have been prepared for such a time as this. This is what you've been preparing for us all along. And may we be obedient to whatever it is that you're calling us to. In Jesus' name, amen.